I think it's about time on the channel that I do a video that I should have done a very long time ago, the basics of distilling. Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Beaver and today we are discussing something we should have discussed on the channel quite a long time ago, and that is the basics of distilling and fermentation and equipment and so on and so forth. So this video is going to be a very fast overview from ingredients all the way to aging and finishing your product, with a couple of pointers or tips or whatever you want to call them as we go along. Now this video is going to be quick and I'm not going to go into detail on a lot of the stuff. Now this is not a comprehensive list by any means of the imagination. This is just a very quick overview of each of the steps and the stuff that is required in each of these steps. Now, if you need any further clarification or you feel that I need to add a video or do a video on any of these points that I'm going to touch on, please put it down in the comments. Pause the video, go down, put a timestamp down and just say this at this stage here, just explain this a little bit better, or maybe do a video on this or whatever. I will also be linking a couple of videos on some of the points that I have covered on the channel up in the card here. So I'm not going to point to them. If I remember, I'm going to point to them, but I'm going to try not to point. Yeah, you get the gist of it. So if you see a little flaggy popping up at the top there, it's a video discussing that specific topic with a bit more information. Now, let's get into this and no more further babbling. So, like I said, this is going to be a very fast, down and dirty overview of the distilling process. Now, I made notes, so bear with me as I go through this. First up is ingredients. Now, when it comes to ingredients, there's three main ingredients that you need to do a fermentation. That will be sugar, water, and yeast. Now those three ingredients together will form a product that you will be able to put into your still and distill and get a product out that you can use, drink, whatever you want to do with it. And that's called a sugar wash. But variations of that will determine other products. Already getting off topic. Let's first look at the first ingredient, water. Now when we say water, now this question comes up a ton. When the word water is used, what kind of water are we talking about? Now, the water I use on the channel, and as you have seen before, is bottles of water like this. Now, this is not store-bought water. This is borehole water or well water. This is pumped up from deep down in the earth here in our area from my father-in-law. Reason why I use this water is I like the taste of it and I like the flavor profile that it adds to my product. Now, can you use tap water? Absolutely 100%. If you are willing to drink your tap water, you can use it for fermentation and distillation. You can use it to cut your product with and make beer, whatever you want. On that point, even if you don't want to drink the water, there is couple of companies that do use dam water or river water to make their product. Companies like Lefroy, the whiskey company, they use quite murky and danky water that they use for their fermentation that adds a character and profile to their end product. Now that's once again getting off topic. So, water. Underwater I wrote what kind of water can we use? Like I just said, any kind of water. If you're willing to drink it, chances are you're not going to have any issue while you are doing your fermentation or your distillation. One side point on that there is if your water is heavily chlorinated or added chemicals in there that you do not want in your end product, don't use it. But yeah, the end of the day, willing to drink it, you can use it. Step number 2. What is the difference between nutrient and water conditions? Now this comes up a ton when you start talking about distillation or fermentation or making beer or whatever you're doing, and people confuse the two. Nutrient is the stuff your yeast needs to convert the sugars in your wash into alcohol. Water conditioning or water treatment or water softeners are the stuff that you add to change the profile of the water. So later on in the video we will talk about nutrient versus water conditioning. Next up, pH. Now the pH of your water will be different. If you're going to use normal tap water, your pH should be around 7. The water pH will not be adjusted before you add your ingredients. You will only test and adjust your pH if you want to after you added all your ingredients. Just a quick example, if you're making a cinnamon mampur or a cinnamon brandy or a lemon brandy for that matter, that is going to drop your pH substantially because you're putting a lot of acid into your wash. Now if you pre-adjusted your water pH down to below 6 and you start adding the lemons in, you're going to have a very acidic environment and your yeast is not going to like it. So get yourself a set of standard pH strips. You can pick it up at any of your brew shops. I picked up these from Prohibition home brewers. If you want to get your hands on some of these strips, they're relatively cheap. I'll put a link down to Prohibition to the website down in the description. So yeah, pick up one of these strips. And remember, pH is only adjusted after you add your ingredients. Next up, temperature. Is there a correct water temperature? The answer is no. This will once again depend on the type of recipe you are following and the type of ingredients that you are using. More on that a bit later, but there is no correct water temperature that you need to get your water to kill off any bacteria or anything like that. If you want to pre-boil your water and allow it to cool down, if that floats your boat, go for it. Do I do it? No, I do not. I do not boil my water beforehand to remove anything inside the water. We are going to put it into a boiler at the end of the day, and that's going to kill off just about anything. Flavor. Does the water impact the flavor of the end product? Absolutely, 100%, hands down, yes. Does it make a huge difference? Depends on what kind of water you are using. Now, if you're going to use, like the company I mentioned before, Lefroy, a natural source of water, meaning a dam or a river or a canal or whatever it is, if you're going to use that kind of water and there is some funky flavors in there, yes, that will pull through into your distillate and it will add character to it. If you're going to compare my tap water to your tap water, is there going to be a huge difference? Probably not. If you're going to compare tap water to bottled water, probably not. But yes, water can have an impact on your final product depending on how much flavor is in the starting water. Next up on our ingredients list is sugar. Now, sugar is one of those things that confuses a lot of people when we talk about sugar. Now, there's a multitude of different types of sugar out there. Just to name a few, you have sucrose, normal table sugar. Now, sucrose is a combination of glucose and fructose, and you can break that bond by using a process of inverting. Now, we're not going to discuss inverting sugars here. There's a bunch of videos out there. I'll also link a video up here where I discuss the difference between inverting sugar and normal sugar. But yeah, next up is fructose. Now, fructose is fruit sugars. These are the sugars you will get from fruit. So if you're doing a fruit wash or a fruit mash or a fruit wine, whatever you want to call it, that will be a fructose blend. Are you going to add sucrose into that? More than likely to bump your ABV so you can actually get more usable product out of it. But yeah, video for another day. Next up, you have glucose. Now, glucose might sound familiar to a lot of people. Glucose is blood sugars. Now, that is the sugar, and it's probably in one of its purest forms, sugar like dextrose. Now, homebrewers like to use dextrose. Dextrose is such a simple sugar, meaning it is probably closest to what you're going to get to a base sugar than it comes. Your yeast likes to eat it and your body likes to absorb it. It is a very good sugar. Brewers like it because it keeps the yeast happy and it doesn't add any funky flavors. Cool. Next up we have maltose. Now maltose is exactly how the word sounds. It is sugars obtained from grains or seeds or from malted products. So as you see in the bag in front of me here, this is some heavy peated Scottish barley, and once we're going to mash this in, we will end up having maltose. Okay, now maltose, once again, yeast likes it because it is a more basic form of a sugar, not a complicated chemical structure that the yeast first needs to break up. It is a very basic, it's two glucose molecules bound together to form what is referred to as a maltose. Now, those are just a few basic sugars. Yes, there is a plethora of other sugars out there, but those are the basic ones you're going to come up to. Now, if somebody says how much sugar is in your wash, they are referring to any of those kinds of sugars. How much sugars did you obtain from your fruit? How much sugars did you add by table sugar, dextrose, brown sugar, white sugar, doesn't really matter. How much sugar did you add? So the word sugar is pretty interchangeable depending on what kind of wash you're making. How much sugar should you use in a wash? Now that is once again a question that ties into another question. What kind of yeast are you using? We're going to discuss yeast next, so don't want to go into too much detail with that, but depending on the yeast that you will be using, that will determine how much sugar you need to add into your fermenter. If you add too much, the yeast won't operate. If you add too little, you won't have a good yield. If you add just enough, you will get a consistent product. So how much should you add? Unfortunately, that's not an answer that I can just blurt out and say, add 4 kilograms of sugar to a 20-liter wash. That should give you a good product. Unfortunately, no. Because if you use a specific yeast strain, it might not be able to chew through that amount of sugars. So if you ever get a recipe online, quickly pop into a ALCOCALCOLATOR. I'll link one down in the description that I use to calculate the potential alcohol by the amount of sugar and water that I will end up using. And then you can check on your yeast manufacturer website or whatever you're going to use on the spec sheet or data sheet, whether that yeast will actually be able to consume that amount of sugar. Yeast. Now, yeast is a touchy subject if there ever was one when it comes to distilling, because there's a lot of arguments regarding yeast and in and around yeast. My personal opinion on yeast is, does it make a difference in your distillation or your fermentation? Absolutely 100% yes. If you asked me before I started the channel and I was just using brewer's yeast and baker's yeast, if it's going to make a difference, I would have said no. Starting the channel, having access or having been sent a whole bunch of different yeast strains over the last couple of months and testing these ones, believe me, it makes a difference. There's flavors that are brought into your wash that you would never have expected. It clears out quicker, it does a whole bunch of stuff, it ferments faster, it ferments cleaner. Yes, yeast does make a difference. Now, do you need to rush out and buy the most expensive box of yeast or packet of yeast or type of yeast you can find? No. Once again, tailor it to the recipe you're going to be making. Majority of the yeast you will be buying in store will be some or other form of Saccharomyces yeast, and they will just have different tolerance levels. Now, if you want to know more about yeast, check my yeast video up here where I go into a little bit more detail on the different types of yeast and the temperatures and the potential ABVs you can expect out of it. Once again, I'm not saying that if you are going to be using baker's yeast, you will not be able to get 12%. There are people that do. There are people that get up to 18% on that stuff. And why do they do it? How and why do they get there? I do not know. Right nutrients, right yeast strain, and at the end of the day, yeah, perfect conditions and the yeast is happy. Quick overview of yeast. This is brewer's yeast. Now, this is a commercial product here in South Africa that you can go into any kind of store, pick it up, buy it, and use it to distill with. This adds a nice and malty smell and a beer-like smell to your washes and your products that carries over into your distillate. Over here is a big jar of baker's yeast. Now, this here adds a nice sourdough, fresh bread kind of smell to your fermentation, and it does not lend itself well to pulling into your distillation. So yeah, this does like lower temperatures when it ferments. When I say lower, anything from 20 to 25 degrees centigrade, and these babies are happy. This yeast strain over here likes a little bit hotter temperatures, and they tend to want to go up to about 28 to work effectively. And then you have stuff like this. Now, this is a new type of yeast that was sent to me a couple of weeks ago by a company called Icon, and this is a distiller strain of yeast. Now, if you get the yeast and you smell it, it smells completely different to any other yeast that you've ever opened up. Tested this yeast and it chews through sugar. But once again, it likes higher temperatures. This stuff here goes up to about 32 degrees centigrade, and then it takes off like a rocket. It does go down into the temperature range, so you have a wider temperature range to work with, but it tends to work a bit slower at lower temperatures. Now, if you want to get your hands on some of this yeast, once again, pop a link down in the description where you can pick up this distiller's yeast. The good thing about using a distiller's yeast is you can push for a higher ABV and consistently hit that number. Between 15 to 18% is what this yeast is rated for. Higher ABV going into the pot means more product out of the pot. What did I say about yeast now? ABV of yeast. Okay, check out my video up top there for ABVs of the yeast. Flavor, does it add flavor? Yes. Nutrient. Now, let's quickly talk about nutrient. Now, nutrient is the stuff that your yeast needs to perform its duty. If sugar is the fuel for your yeast, the nutrient is the oil. For your motor vehicle, needs oil and water to run, same as your yeast needs fuel and it needs its nutrients. Now, nutrients come in the form of diammonium phosphate. We all know it as DAP. Now, that is a nutrient you can buy from your local brew shops and add it into your wash. That will add a whole plethora of nitrogen and sulfates and ureas into your product that will assist your yeast in performing its duties. It's like the lubrication for your yeast to perform pretty well. If you have no nutrients and you have a ton of sugar, your yeast will just stall. Ask anybody ever trying to make a sugar wash. If you do not add nutrients in there, it will stall. Now, what does your yeast need in the form of nutrients? You need nitrogen, zinc, phosphate, and urea. Those five different components is needed for your yeast to convert sugar into alcohol. If those things are not there, your yeast will chew up a little bit of sugar and it will just go dormant because there's nothing else driving it. Okay, cool. Now this question comes up a lot. How much yeast do you add into your fermentation? Depending on the manufacturer's recommendation or depending on the yeast strain that you're using, that will determine how much yeast you need to add. If you buy normal distiller's yeast or packet yeast or bread yeast, the recommended dosage is 1 gram of dry yeast per 1 liter of product. If you add more yeast, is it gonna make a difference? Yes, it is gonna make a difference. It will allow your fermentation to kick off quicker, but also having that much yeast in your, I'm not saying if you add 2 grams it's going to make a big difference, but if you go and add 10 grams per liter, you're going to put so much yeast into solution that your time for your wash to clear out is going to be so long that it is not worth the speed at which the yeast chewed through the sugars. Okay, if you can, you add too little yeast. Yes, you can. Remember now, once you have made up your wash or your mash or your wort, what's going to happen is you're going to introduce a bacteria, or in our case, we're going to introduce yeast. Now, we want that yeast to overrun that fermentation so no other bacteria can take a foothold. Also, the faster the yeast chews through that sugar, the higher it raises the alcohol content and the less chance you have of infection. Ask any beer homebrewer, if you're working with low ABV beers, infection is a nightmare. If you're going into stouts and stuff that has pretty high gravities and high ABVs, your chances of infections are a lot lower. I'm not saying impossible, just lower. Cool. We use alcohol as a sanitizer, and that's exactly what it does. It just kills off bugs. Nutrients and how much yeast. Can you add too little? Yes, you can add too little yeast so that the yeast colony cannot establish itself within the wash before something else takes over. Cool. That brings us to our next point, hygiene. Now, hygiene in the form of sanitizing, disinfecting, ensuring that your equipment is nice and clean and there's no foreign bacteria or yeast strains or anything that can get into your fermentation and just bugger the whole thing up. What do you use for sanitization? Well, I use normal Jik or bleach. Now, I dilute my bleach down and I use a big ass bucket full of that bleach solution to rinse down all surfaces and wash all tools. That includes my hydrometers and my temperature gauges and my spoons and everything before I start my day. Okay, before I start putting sugar in and all that other stuff, I do a blanket cleaning with bleach. Once I'm in the process of doing the putting the together of the wash or the water, whatever you want to call it, I then switch over to a no rinse sanitizer. Now, a no rinse sanitizer like Star San or Chichochan or something like that, you can go and buy at your local brew shop. You buy them in a little bottle like this. This is a standard no rinse sanitizer, a little cap full of that in about a liter of product, and you are for a way to start spraying and cleaning your stuff. Reason why I use no rinse and not the Jik any further is the Jik you need to rinse off and clean off. But once everything is nice and sanitized, using a nice little no rinse will keep the buggies away. Cool. So just get in the habit of cleaning. Don't go OCD about it and scrub down everything like as if you're a doctor walking into an operation theater. Just be mindful of keeping the area nice and clean and not introducing any foreign bacteria. Exactly as you wouldn't go and put a random thing in your mouth that you picked up. You don't want something random ending up in your fermentation. Cool. So I will be remiss if we are talking about ingredients and I do not touch on mashing. Now, mashing is not the stuff that you do with your mashed potatoes. It's actually the process where we take grain, we take the starches out of the grains and we convert those starches into sugars using an enzyme called amylase. Now, that is a subject for a whole nother time. If you want to see more about mashing and temperatures and all that other fun stuff, I'll link a video up here that I did for a couple of all grain whiskies that we've done on the channel before, that explains the whole process in a bit more detail. If you require further information, please pop it down in the comments. I will gladly get back to you regarding what is mashing in. Now, quick little points when it comes to mashing and using grains. Temperature is critically important when it comes to that. Depending on the grain that you're using, you need to activate the amylase at certain temperatures. If you do not hit those numbers and you don't keep those temperatures constant, you will not get an efficient mash, and you will not convert the starches into sugars, and then you will not be able to ferment that, and so on and so forth. Potential for infections. Yes, mashing and using grain does lead to a higher chance of getting infections and your wash or your wort or your mash, whatever you want to call it, going bad. So yes, there is a higher inherent risk when using grain than using fruits or sugars. Next up, the actual fermentation. First up, your fermenter. What can you use for a fermenter, and what is a fermenter? Well, fermenter is basically a vessel that you add all your ingredients into that has enough volume for everything to be added in together, mixed all together and left alone. You need to be able to do two things with your fermenter. Number one, you need to be able to keep bugs and stuff out, so you need to be able to seal it in some or other way, whether you put cheesecloth over the top or you use what is referred to as an airlock. It doesn't matter, but it can be something as simple as a bucket. You can use a standard bucket. Just make sure the bucket you buy is a food grade bucket and the plastic won't leach any foul chemicals or something stupid into your wash. Also make sure that the material is nice and a quality material and creates a good enough seal on top. Reason being is this thing is going to move around and you're going to pick it up, and if the handle wants to break while you are carrying it, believe me, it's a really shitty mess to clean up if there is alcohol and just random stuff all over the floor. Smells bad, takes a long time to clean up. Get something that has a good quality handle so it doesn't bend or break easily. You can use carboys, you can use conical fermenters. It does not matter. As long as it's enough volume and it is made from a material that won't leach into your product. Cool? Happy? Lacquer. Now let's move on to what is fermentation. So this question once again comes up quite a lot when you start talking to new distillers or new homebrewers. What is the process of fermentation? Well, the process of fermentation is basically when your yeast starts consuming the sugar and it converts the sugar into ethanol or alcohol and a whole bunch of other byproducts as well as CO2. That is the fermentation. Now fermentation happens at different temperatures. Once again, depending on what yeast strain you are using, you'll be fermenting at different temperatures. There is no set correct temperature that I can say if you use 25 degrees C you will be fine. Unfortunately, no. Like I said earlier on the video, each of these yeast strains have a different temperature range that it works in, but there's a specific temperature that they like. What is needed for fermentation? Now we just went over the ingredients. We need three things to do a fermentation. You need water, you need sugar, and you need yeast. Yes, there are other things in there, nutrients and all the other stuff, but you need those three ingredients. If you have those three, you will be able to do a fermentation. The question that comes up a lot is oxygen. Is it good or is it bad? Now that normally links into guys asking about open and closed fermentations. Let's just quickly talk about oxygen and how yeast works. The moment you add your yeast into your fermenter, what will happen is your yeast will go into a stage that is called aerobic fermentation. or aerobic conversion. Now that is where your yeast consumes oxygen to make themselves more. In that process, the yeast breaks off, makes little daughter cells, and so on and so forth, and they start establishing a colony within your bucket or your fermenter. What you want then to have happen is your yeast then needs to go into a anaerobic fermentation, or a deprived oxygen environment, where it starts consuming the sugars at a rapid rate to convert those sugars into alcohols. So is oxygen a good thing? Yes, in the beginning of your fermentation, you need a ton of oxygen in your fermentation or in your wash so that the yeast can reproduce at a rapid rate, so it takes over the bucket and there's no other bacteria that can jump in there and ruin your fermentation. Once that oxygen in there is done and dusted and there is no more oxygen for the yeast to use, they will get down and dirty and do their job and produce the stuff that we want so we can distill it. Keeping that in mind, I also said in the beginning here, open versus closed fermentation. What that refers to is, if you watch any video of a commercial distillery, you will see they have big vats that are open to the air. Can you do that as a fermentation? Meaning there is no lid on the top of the thing. Can you do that for fermentation? Absolutely 100% you can. The only drawbacks of that is that anything like ants and bugs and flies and stuff can get into your fermentation, and I'm pretty sure you do not want that in your bucket or in your end product. CO2 is heavier than air, so the moment your fermentation kicks off, it will have a buffer layer of CO2 on top, and that's what the commercial distillers bank on, is the fact that that CO2 air buffer on top will keep the bugs out. Closed fermentation. Closed fermentation is when you put a lid on and you use an airlock. So no impurities, nothing can come into your product from outside. Only stuff that's inside can escape out in the form of CO2. That is where we get to airlocks or bubblers or whatever you want to call it, the little tube in a jar. It just prevents anything from going back into your distillate. This is probably a question that is very interesting. How long will fermentation take? So that is a very good question, as well as a very vague question, because the answer is I will not be able to tell you. The reason being is this will be determined by a few factors. Number one, what is your wash like? How much sugar is in there? How much work does the yeast need to do to convert it? Take a 2% wash. 2% wash will be done in a day or two. Take a 10% wash. That might take up to 5, maybe 10 days to ferment out, depending on what the temperature you're fermenting on, depending on what yeast strain you're using, and if there's enough nutrients in there for the yeast to actually go to work. So, how long will fermentation take? That depends. That brings us on to our next point. Understanding when your fermentation is starting and when your fermentation is finishing. Now, there's only one way, and one way only, for you to know that your fermentation has finished. Yes, there's a couple of other indicators that you can use, like is the wash bitter, has the bubbles stopped bubbling, is the wash, if you stick your finger in, you allow it to dry, is it still sticky, that means there's sugar left in there. There's a ton of stuff that you can do, but there's only one surefire way of knowing that your fermentation is finished, and that is using something that will give you your specific gravity, or your gravity. Now this over here is referred to as a hydrometer. Now this is just basically a little floaty thingy that has been calibrated. If you drop this into water, it should read on 1.000, meaning that this is the gravity of water. There's no other dissolved things in the water to raise the viscosity of the water. Now, once you start adding anything into the water, you can add salt, you can add sugar, you can add, what else? Well, cool drink for that matter, into that water. The moment you start doing that, you are changing the density of that liquid. In turn, changing the viscosity. Now, this will measure that for you. And it will also read out on the side where your alcohol potential is. For you to know when your fermentation is finished, what do you need to know? Is that all the sugars that are in there have been chewed up. So you want your gravity to be back to 1 or below 1. Alcohol is less dense than water, so it should be slightly less dense at the end of fermentation than pre-fermentation. So let's go before. Before is referred to as your starting gravity or your original gravity, and that is once you are done with your recipe and you drop this bobber in there, it will float on a specific level. That level will translate either into bricks or potential ABV. If you now go and you drop this into your bucket after you did your recipe, and this reading gives you a 1.080 or a 1080, doesn't matter what you call it, that means there is 80 gravity points added to your liquid. If that ferments out to 1 or below 1, you should have a potential alcohol between 12 and 13%, depending on how low it ferments out. Do you need to be very accurate when it comes to reading your hydrometer during distillation? The answer is no. It doesn't need to be super accurate. A rough estimation will be able to tell you what kind of product you're going to pull off or how much product you're going to pull off. And when I say rough, I mean within a % or two, you should be fine. The next question that comes up a lot when it comes to fermentation is, my fermentation has stopped. We call it has stalled. Why does a fermentation stall? Fermentation stalls for one of 3 reasons. Number 1, you have reached your maximum potential alcohol for the strain of yeast that you are using. You added enough sugar into the wash to go up to 10%. Your yeast can only produce 6%. That other 4% that's left in there, or on the gravity scale there, will never ferment out because the yeast cannot consume any more sugars because the alcohol tolerance of the yeast has been exceeded. That's number 1. Number 2, there is way too much sugar. Now this tends to happen. The yeast starts off with a bang and all of a sudden it just stops. Reason being is the sugar, when you have your wash and you're done mixing it all together, everything is nice and homogenized, but the sugar tends to settle out down to the bottom. So your top layer of your wash has a nice and low sugar or a lower sugar content level on top. The yeast starts chewing up on that there, but the moment it starts getting down to the rest of the sugars, the sugar concentration is too high and the yeast just dies. Okay? And last but not least is nutrient. You did not add sufficient nutrients for the yeast to actually consume that amount of sugars. How do you fix stalls? 1, add some water. You can bump up the amount of water, meaning you are diluting the solution down. So if there's too much sugar, the yeast will start getting back to work. If there's too much alcohol, the yeast will start getting back to work because you've now diluted the solution down. Or add additional nutrients. Now you can add DAP, you can add tomato paste, you can add whatever the hell you want that you consider to be nutrient into your wash. And that should get your yeast nice and active. Little word of advice: if you're ever going to add anything into your wash after fermentation or after fermentation has started, make sure you add it in increments. Don't go and dump a whole bunch of stuff in there, because it's going to release all that trapped CO2 inside of that wash and it's just going to foam everywhere and you're going to make a massive mess. So add it slowly, stir it up, don't add all at once. Clearing your wash, is it necessary? That will depend. Now, I tend to leave my washes so it clears out before I add it into my boiler. Reason being is I don't want excessive amounts of yeast still in suspension when I start my distillation. That might end up adding funky flavors or making the tails, especially in like a rum run where you want some of those tailsy flavors to blend back into your product, might just ruin those tails because of the excessive amounts of yeast still in suspension. Now, how do you clear your wash? Number one, make sure your wash is done, completely fermented dry. Then you can either leave it for a couple of days, the yeast will fall out of suspension and lay down on the bottom. Or number two, you can use what is referred to as a fining agent or a clearing agent, or basically like a little bit of a sieve that just drags everything in the wash down. You can use bentonite or gelatin. Now bentonite, you can buy it at your local brew shop, or you can even buy it at your local health shop. The bentonite clay, you mix it up with some water, add it into your wash. It's negatively charged and the rest of the stuff is positively charged, tracks it together, drops out to the bottom. Does it help? Yes. Do I do it? Absolutely 100%. I allow my wash to clear out. That just gives me a better end product. What I will be doing for the video is I will be putting up timestamps in the description box below. So if you want to skip ahead or skip back or whatever, timestamps will be in the bottom there. As well as I'll type out as much as I can of this down the bottom. And remember, hit that little subscribe button down there. Next up, sediment. Now what is sediment, or barm, or lees, or dross, or slag, or whatever, or not slag, sludge, whatever you call it, or your hobby calls it. It is the stuff that settles out to the bottom of your fermenter after fermentation is finished. You'll actually see it happen during fermentation, but that's all the dead yeast cells and unconsumed sugars and all the other stuff that just dropped out to the bottom, and that is referred to as the sediment. Now, can you reuse that sediment? Absolutely, 100%. Do you want that sediment in your boiler? Absolutely not. For the before mentioned point where you do not want those yeast flavors pulling into your distillate, or you don't want a excessive amount of sediment to form in the bottom of your boiler that can lead to scorching, you don't want to use the sediment in your boiler. Things you can use the sediment for. You can use it if you're going to do a generational run and you want to just add sugar and water and whatever you were using, fruits and all that other stuff, back into the bucket on top of that sediment, fill it up with water again and reuse that yeast that's in there. You can do that. If it's a generational run like the Millipop Moonshine, where we use the barn and the back set and so on to do multiple runs one after the other to increase the flavor profile, you can use it for that as well. And last but not least, when it comes to fermentation, we are talking about infection. Now, we already discussed sanitizing and ensuring that you keep everything nice and clean right in the beginning of the video, but infections do happen. And is there stuff you can do to prevent it? Yes, keep everything nice and clean. Try not to open the fermenter too much or put stuff that's not been sanitized into the fermenter when you're doing your gravity reading and that type of stuff. Make sure everything is sanitized and nothing gets introduced into the wash. Next up, distillation. So when we talk about distillation, we're going to divide that into two parts. Number one, equipment, and number two, the process. So first up, equipment. Types of still. Now there is a plethora of stills out there in different forms and combinations, but they boil down to a few different types. You get a pot, a column, a reflux, a CC, VM, and a combo still. Depending on your application, what you want to do and what kind of product you want to make, that will determine what kind of still you're going to be using. Now, I'm not going to go into details what each of these stills do and what they are used for. All I'm going to say is there is a plethora of stills out there, and do research. I'll post a link up here for a couple of videos on different stills and what different stills do, depending on what you want to do with them. Packing versus plates. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail when it comes to packing versus plates. If you want me to do a complete video on the difference, please let me know. I will link up a couple of videos here from other channels that have done videos on the comparison between packing versus plates. All you need to know as a hobby distiller or new to the hobby or thinking of getting into the hobby is both of those are used to increase your final ABV. All it does, it acts like a physical scrub inside of your distillation. So by adding those things in, whether it's plate or packing, you are now forcing your vapor to travel a larger distance or be abruptly stopped within your distillation before it can move on. By doing that, all you're doing is you're removing flavor and increasing ABV. Next up, boilers. What can you use as a boiler? And when we talk about a boiler, we mean the pot that you add your wash into, that you put an element into or fire below it to get your mash or wash or whatever it is to heat up and form a vapor that you then let go through whatever type of still head you have and then condense at the end to form a distillate or the product. What kind of boilers do you need? What size boiler do you need? Once again, that is a topic for a whole different video. All I am saying is look at your need that you want to establish and then get a still according to that. So if you want to do bigger runs, meaning 20, 30, 40 liter runs, you will need a bigger still that can accommodate that. If you just want to play around and mess around with gin recipes on a small scale, then a small 5 liter still will be more than sufficient for you. So once again, that is something you're going to have to look at and understand what you want to do. What kind of materials can you use for a boiler? Now, once again, very controversial subject, but any material that will not leach into your product. So food grade aluminium is okay, depending on who you ask. I don't see anything wrong with it, but yeah, it depends. Stainless steel, okay, great to keep clean and a fantastic product to use. My boiler is stainless steel and I haven't had a day's worth of issues. Or copper. Copper is the common one that everybody says and everybody sees and everybody uses, or most of people prefer to use. Why? Number one, it's easy to work with. Number two, it looks pretty cool when it's all polished up. Size of the boiler will depend on what you want to use, and what kind of material you use depends on what you feel comfortable with. But keeping in mind that if you're going to use something that's going to leach into your product inside of your boiler, that is going to end up in your final distillate. So don't use anything that you do not feel comfortable eating off of or swallowing a small piece of. Keep it to the basics, stainless steel and copper, and you should be fine. Your heat source. Keeping it on the idea of the boiler still, the heat source. Now when I'm talking about the heat source, I'm meaning the physical thing that is going to produce the heat that is going to go into your still to heat up your liquid and turn it into a vapor. So if you're going to use a element or are you going to use gas, that's all up to you. If you're going to use an element, remember you need some form of a control to allow you to change the amount of energy that's going into your still. Because if you cannot control the energy going into your still, you will not be able to control the distillate coming out of your still. Same as with the gas. If you're going to use gas or wood, it doesn't matter. But at the end of the day, you need to be able to control and accurately control the amount of energy you're putting in. Input versus output. Yes, there's an equation out there, and I'm not 100% confident in using it yet, but there is an equation out there that you can calculate the amount of energy you need to put into your still to produce X amount of distillate, and how much energy is it going to take, and how long is it going to take, and all that other stuff. Now, I was taught when I started this hobby that you determine your ABV by your takeoff speed to a certain degree within a range of ABVs. I'm not saying that if you take a pot still and you run it extremely slow, you're going to get 80% out of it. But what I'm saying is that depending on how much energy you're putting in and the time that you allow that chemical bond to break between the different molecules within your wash will determine what kind of ABV you're going to get out. Okay, cool, to a certain degree. Input power versus output. Yes, there is an equation. If you want me to do a full video on that and talk a bit more about takeoff speeds and what kind of ABVs you can expect, please pop it down in the comments and I will formulate the video around that. That brings us to our next one, takeoff. The product that you take off the tip or at the end of your condenser. Now the condenser is another piece of the equipment that you run cold water through, whether it is a bucket with a worm on the inside or a spiral copper tube or a stainless steel tube that the distillate travels through so it cools from a vapor back into a liquid. Or you use a shotgun condenser or a Levy condenser, doesn't matter what it is, where you have water running around the outside of your condenser. All what we're doing is we're cooling down the distillate back into the vapor back into a distillate. The takeoff, once again, I'll say it, this will determine your ABV to a certain degree within a range of 10 to 20% ABV. You can determine that by either increasing your takeoff speed or decreasing your takeoff speed. Now the method you use to increase your takeoff and decrease your takeoff is exactly proportional to the amount of power you're putting in. The more power you're putting into your still, you are then increasing the temperature, thus increasing the vapor speed. By increasing the vapor speed, not actually the temperature, but yeah, you're increasing the vapor speed. By increasing the vapor speed, you're increasing the amount of product coming off. If you decrease the energy going in, you're effectively decreasing the amount of energy going in, decreasing your vapor speed, and that decreases the speed that you take off your product at. Whew. Sorry for the long video, guys, but I wanted it all in one video, different timestamps at the bottom, so you can skip backwards and forwards. But yeah, let's just get one full video of everything out there. The actual distillation process. When you are doing the actual distillation, yes, you add energy into your still at the bottom or your boiler. That then turns your liquid into a vapor. Your vapor then travels up. It travels through your top of your still, whether it's a column or a pot or a reflux or whatever it is. It then goes into your condenser and it comes out the bottom. Once you start getting product coming off the front end there, you start collecting it. And that collection is then placed into a category called cuts. So the word cuts mean literally foreshots, heads, hearts, and tails. Now those come off in exactly the same sequence every single time. You cannot take tails before heads and hearts and whatever. I did a full video on the difference between the cuts up here and also explaining how to use reflux to compress your cuts. So we'll make the transition between your cuts nice and clean. So yeah, cuts mean that physical difference between your heads, your hearts, your tails, and your foreshots, and so on. Then you also get something called cuts jars. Now, depending on how you distill and how you prefer to distill, some people use cut jars like me. I prefer to use cut jars, meaning I collect my distillate in small 250 ml jars as it comes off the still. This allows me to control my flavor. So it allows me to control my flavor as well as to identify that moment when I start moving into tails, and I can then start compressing my tails or capturing my tails and stop the distillation when I'm happy with the kind of flavors I have. So yes, cuts can mean these little jars, or it can mean that physical cuts, your heads, your hearts, and your tails. Predominantly, we consume the hearts. Now the hearts cut is the part of the distillation that we like to drink. The speed of the offtake will determine whether you take it off fast or slow, will determine the flavor and the ABV of the end product. Next up, stripping run versus spirit runs. Now this question comes up a ton on the forums as well as on the groups. What's the difference between a stripping run and a spirit run? Stripping run literally means what you say or the word says. It's stripping. It's taking your product that you put into your still, taking that alcohol inside of that there and stripping it out of there as quickly as possible. So you're running your still hot, you're running your still fast, you're not worrying about cuts, you're not worrying about flavor. All you're doing is you're putting up energy and you are putting your condenser on its maximum speed. So all you're doing is taking off product as fast as possible. That's a stripping run. Now the reason for a stripping run is when you take a large volume of wash. So like me only having a 35 liter boiler, if I have a 100 liter wash, I will do 3 stripping runs to decrease that 100 liters into enough to only do 1 full spirit run. So a nice slow run where I take the product that I want at the end. So that is a spirit run. Once you are producing the product that will go into the bottles, you have a spirit run. Do you need to do a second and third and fourth distillation? Once again, that's 100% up to you. If you want more detail on that, you know the drill by now, down in the comments. Vodkas and whiskies and those things, yes, they are triple distilled. Some are 4 times distilled. It all depends on what kind of flavor profile you're looking for. The more you distill something, the less flavor you are going to have, because every time it runs through the still, you are stripping away the flavor. Temperatures. What temperatures do you run your still at? Now, that's once again a touchy subject, and some guys track temperatures, some guys don't. I prefer not to track temperatures anywhere on my still, whether it's in my boiler, in my column, or my point of no return. I purely go by feel, by taste, by smell, and that will determine when I do my transitions between my cuts and my flavors and that type of stuff. I do not use temperatures. What I'll do is I'll link a video of George up here where he just explains temperatures within your still, and he's pretty good at explaining when to do your cuts and what boils at what temperature and so on and so forth. There is just one temperature that I keep in mind whenever I need to track a temperature, and that is 100 degrees centigrade, and that is the boiling point of water. If I am running my still and all of a sudden I have no distillate coming off and I measure the temperature on the top of my still and it's close to 100 degrees centigrade, that means I have run out of alcohol inside of my boiler and I no longer have any product coming off. So I actually needed to stop my run a long time ago. ABV and flavor. Now this question came up actually before I started filming this video on one of the Facebook groups again. And does the ABV that you distill at matter? Yes, I did a video up here where we answered the question, does ABV actually matter? And we also did an experiment where we tried different ABVs for different kinds of woods, and does it affect the flavor of the wood? So ABV does matter. The higher your ABV becomes, the less flavor you are getting in your product. Now it's a pretty linear scale up to a certain stage, and then it just starts slowly plateauing off up until the point where you have what's referred to as a neutral. Now I see a lot of guys on the groups chasing ABV, trying to get it as high as possible. That is not the point of distillation. The point of distillation is to make a product that you want at the flavor profile that you want. That brings us to flavor. The lower the ABV, the more flavor you're going to get. But Do not think that if you have an apple wash and you distill it, it's going to taste like apple. It will have the characteristics of an apple. And because you distilled it and you know what's in there, you will be able to smell apples and taste apples. But other people might have a difficult time getting to that point. Unless you tell them, listen here, this is an apple brandy. Oh yeah, I can smell the apples. But yeah, the flavor will be a character or a nuanced, faint flavor of the product that you put into the still. Unless you're doing something like a rum, where there is like big, bold flavors coming through, and you'll be able immediately to pick up that that was done with molasses. The product. Now, once you are done with your distillation and you have done your cuts, you have either one big jar in front of you with a couple of small jars on either side with your heads and your tails, or you have like me, where you have a ton of small little jars, each having a certain portion of your heads, your hearts, and your tails in them, and you now need to blend it back together, and that's the term blending. So why do we blend? The reason why we blend is to get the product that we want. So if you're going to add a little bit of tails to get a bit more of those funky flavors coming in, a little bit more robust, or more flavorsome product out of your tails, a little bit more of the oils in there that gives it a better mouthfeel and so on, you're going to blend that back in. Or if you are a hearts guy that just wants that nice clean hearts cut, that's what you're going to take. And yeah, blending just basically means taking all those jars and weighing it into a thing depending on what kind of flavors you want. Oils. Now, when you are distilling, or I said oil / cloudy, when you're distilling and you're using fresh orange peels, or even dried orange peels, or lemon peels, or botanicals, there tends to be a lot of oils in your distillate that once you start adding water into your final product, it starts going cloudy. Now, there is an upcoming video where I talk about cloudy distillate, but I have done one before and it's up here, where I talk a bit more about what is cloudy distillate and why it happens and how to fix it. Cool. Next up, proof. Now, proof and ABV is exactly the same thing. It's just a different version of measuring the alcohol content. Proof is on a scale from 0 to 200. How much proof, or if something is 100 proof, it means it's 50% ABV. Now, ABV stands for alcohol by volume, so it literally means how much of your liquid that you have in front of you is alcohol and how much is other stuff. If you take an alcometer, it looks exactly the same as a hydrometer. It is a version of our hydrometer. Only difference is this one is calibrated completely differently. If you now drop this into water, where your hydrometer would have read water here, this reads water over here now. And the more alcohol within the liquid, the lower this will ride in the water, because alcohol is less dense than water, giving you a reading of alcohol by volume. Cutting. When we use the word cutting your product, or cutting it down, or proofing it down, what we mean is taking a product that you have distilled and you take it off the still at, let's say, 70% across the board. Your final product, you drop your hydrometer in, it measures at 70%, but you want it to be bottled or you want it to be bottled at 40%. You're going to need to cut it or proof it down to 40%. And the way you proof it down is by adding water, or the way you cut it is by adding water. Now, once again, you use a ALCOCALCOLATOR for that. That will determine the amount of water you need to add to take the high ABV and make it lower. Keeping in mind, you cannot reverse that. You can't take water out. You can only add water in. So if you overdo it and you overshoot your ABV, meaning you aim for 40%, you end up with 35%, you're going to have to be happy with 35%. You can't bump it back up again unless you have spare product. But yeah, I'm not going to go into complications. But yeah, cutting basically means taking it from a high proof down to a low proof. So you can either add it into a barrel or age it or put it into a bottle. And it's all up to you. Aging. Now when the term aging is used, it is once again one of those terms that is loosely used within the distillation community. It can mean flavoring your product or turning it into something else. If you have a vodka or a neutral base and you are turning it into a flavored liqueur or into a fruit infused product, or you age it on fruits, or you add caramel flavoring, whatever, into it, that's aging or finishing your product. Commonly, when the word aging is used, it's referred to adding wood to your product. So by adding wood to your product, you'll turn a product that looks like this into a product that looks like this. By adding wood into your product, you are imparting different kinds of flavors in there that will then in turn change the flavor profile of your product. How long that takes, that will be determined by the amount of wood used, the type of wood you use, the ABV that you're going to add it on, and yeah, a whole bunch of other factors. What kind of wood can you use? Well, once again, that you're going to have to do your own research on that, but there's a plethora of wood types out there. On the forums, there's quite a few guys that have quite good information on different types of wood that has been used. I personally have used a variety of different woods, from different fruit trees as well as different hardwood trees that is food safe, so it can be used for chopping boards and that kind of stuff, and the flavors that you want. Once you've aged your product, you have a product that is drinkable. You can then take that product, you remove your wood or your aging, put it on the shelf. It will last a good couple of years or indefinitely, depending on what type of product you made. Now, if you stuck around this far and you listened to me babble for, which I presume is a good long while, thank you very much for sticking around this far. Remember, hit that subscribe button, and if you have any further questions or suggestions, please put them down in the comments so I can get back to you. Or if there's enough people asking for a specific section of this to be turned into a video, I will gladly see how I can do that for you guys. As always, have a lekker day.